Washington making a big move in the battle over Yemen. The United States has moved a naval aircraft carrier, a huge one, the USS Theodore Roosevelt, into the area. The vessel's joining a contingent of American warships that are already positioned off the waters in the Arabian Sea, off of Yemen, and they're ready to intercept any Iranian vessels that may be trying to supply the Houthi rebels who are fighting in Yemen. The White House sounding the alarm on Tehran's continued support of the Shiite rebels fighting the Saudi-led coalition.
We have seen evidence that the Iranians are supplying weapons and other forms of support to the Houthis in Yemen. That's the kind of support that will only contribute to greater violence in that country. These are exactly the kind of destabilizing activities that we have in mind when we raise concerns about Iran's destabilizing activity in the Middle East.
Well, there you go. John Bolton is a former U.S. ambassador to the UN and a Fox News contributor. Welcome. Good to have you here, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you.
That puts him in a tough spot, doesn't it?
Well, I think the administration is correct to move these additional assets, particularly the Roosevelt, into that area. So it's critical for international commerce going through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait into the Red Sea on the way to the Suez Canal and coming out, obviously, the other way. And there is concern about Iran's continued support for the Houthi coalition. This is not new. This has been going on for years.
Right.
And in particular, in the battle for Aden, the critical seaport there, the Houthi and their Yemeni allies have been being pushed back. So the prospect of Iran trying to intervene to help them hold on to significant parts of Aden really is, I think, a major issue in the tactical sense in the battle for Yemen.
Got it. I mean, I think everybody sees the strategic reason why we want to have a very strong presence there right now. I guess the next question is what happens when the Iran ships come into that area and they are trying to deliver supplies to the Houthis in Yemen? And we'll move on to the nuclear arms table in a moment. But, you know, what does this showdown look like and when might it happen?
Well, there's no doubt that deploying these additional forces raises the possibility of an incident at sea. It's hard to say exactly how the Iranians are going to try and get the weapons into the Houthi or whether they'll actually engage forces on land in Aden. But certainly the risk goes up, or the risk, if it's not U.S. naval forces, it could be Saudi or Egyptian forces. This is something that's obviously critical for us. It's not just the Houthi in Yemen who are the problem. It's also al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It's the U.S. national interest here to get stability, get some kind of effective government back in Yemen as soon as we can, so we can then deal in a more responsible fashion with both Houthi and al-Qaeda.
Yeah. So on the one hand, you're trying to prevent Iran from supplying the Houthi fighters in Yemen, and then you're sitting down at the table with them trying to negotiate over a nuclear deal. Doesn't this present an opportunity for leverage? Do you keep the two things totally separate? And how can you really?
Well, I think it's Iran that thinks it has the leverage here. The aid to the Houthi is relatively low cost, low risk for them, at least up until now. I think Tehran believes they can get away with it because the White House is so desperate for the nuclear deal that Iran can fish in troubled waters, which is what it's doing here, without fearing real reprisal or consequences in the nuclear area. So right as of now, I think the momentum's on Iran's side.
But Iran needs the deal, too. I mean, what's going on here?
No,
why can't we?
No,
why not?
Look, the Iranians want relief from the international sanctions.
Yes.
And what they've accomplished in the past couple of years is the sanctions regime has broken down. You can see it in just the past couple of weeks. Look, the Obama administration's own director of national intelligence testified last year that the sanctions had not slowed down the nuclear weapons program. Of course, they'd like to be free of the sanctions. Anybody would. But it hasn't affected their nuclear program.
But they say they need it for economic trade, that there are countries that are, I was looking at their Twitter feed this morning, that they have a lot of countries that want to see these lifted so that they can begin trade with them.
Sure, and a lot of countries already are violating the sanctions, the Russians, the Chinese, and others. This is something that, of course, they'd prefer to be free of the sanctions, but at what cost? I think what they see is the prospect of both being free of the sanctions and being able to pursue their nuclear deal.
It looks like they might get both. What odds do you put on a possible confrontation in the sea, in the Arabian Sea right now?
Well, at this point, I'd put them at a relatively low point, at least from the American point of view. But you're in along the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, it's very narrow. There's not a lot of room to navigate. So I think the prospect for an unintended incident at sea here is actually pretty high. And once that sort of thing happens, developments can take a course that nobody wants or anticipates. I think that's the real danger at the moment.
Certainly can. Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thank you, Martha.